Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Sarah Taylor and I'm your host. We're delighted to welcome our partner Testbirds, who are jointly collaborating with us on today's interactive webinar. As this webinar is interactive, we welcome you to join in the discussion and debate some thought-provoking discussion with our experts. But before we start, please take a moment to check your audio-visual settings while I run through a few items about this session and how you can take part. Today's webinar will last approximately 1 hour. Within that time, you will have many opportunities to interact by simply typing your question to us in the questions box. To type your questions, go to the control panel at the right-hand side of your screen and type your questions under the questions drop-down. Please don't be shy. All questions welcome. So without further ado, let's meet the presenters. Jeff Thompson from Qualitest and a warm welcome to Carl Fryer from Testbirds. I'll now hand over to Jeff and Carl, who will tell you a bit more about themselves. So Jeff, Carl, over to you.
Hi everybody, my name is Jeff Thompson and I work for Qualitest, and I'm really pleased to be here today with Carl to talk to you about customer journeys in BFSI. My background has been in testing now for about, disappointingly for me, 40 odd years, starting off on mainframe testing, going through year 2000, and in the latter years of my life, now account managing big testing commitments for Qualitest. Carl, would you like to introduce yourself?
Absolutely, thank you, Jeff. Yeah, so hello everyone, my name is Carl. I work for Testbirds. I've been working here for about 4.5, nearly 5 years within the testing space, so a little bit less than Jeff there. But essentially, I work in the accounts team, leading the team within the international business unit, helping clients all over the world with their sort of crowd testing requirements.
Thanks, Carl. Well, obviously, Carl and I will interact throughout this presentation, so you'll hear a lot more from both of us as we carry on. But before we do that, we just want to introduce our own companies. And before I do that, I just need to explain to you that behind me is actually real. So I'll take questions on anything you can see behind me later on. So who are Qualitest? Qualitest are the world's largest AI-powered quality engineering company. What do I mean by that? So there are lots of companies that do testing, but we're the only independent company with over 5,000 testers around the world. We also have our own AI-powered engine that helps us with our quality engineering. Excuse me. We'll talk a little bit about AI later on. So what we're about is effectively anything end-to-end testing. So starting from manual testing, automated testing, performance testing, accessibility testing, usability testing, any testing, you know, in Agile, in Waterfall, whatever our clients require. For the last 6 years, Gartner have recognized us as a visionary, and a lot of that has been around our AI-powered technology that is helping testers to understand better the scope of their testing. So we provide not only physical testing, but advice and consultancy to testing organizations on how to improve what they do. Qualitest has been around now for many, many years. So, but it's probably the biggest secret out there. So I will understand if a lot of you have never heard of us before, but we are the largest and we do provide exceptional service to our customers. I'll hand over to Carl now, who will introduce Testbirds.
Perfect, thank you, Jeff. Yeah, so Testbirds at its core is a crowd testing agency. We've been going since 2011, started in Munich, but then grown into places like London, where I'm based, and Amsterdam as well. But the whole premise of crowd testing is to sit as another type of testing alongside the stuff that Qualitest do. The whole idea is that we have 600,000 testers on a global scale who are real testers, meaning that we can give access to our clients to test with real people, real locations, with real devices. And we test on both functional and usability services based upon our clients' goals. Our testers each have 65 different demographic criteria, so it always means that we can really find the individuals that our clients are trying to hit, whether that's for BFSI or for telcos or whatever it is. And essentially it means that we can give that real aspect to testing in real environments with real people to give sort of real feedback in that sense. So that's Testbirds as in a sort of nutshell. But maybe then we can kick off today. And Jeff, actually putting this on as a question of you and to the title of today's talk is maybe you could take us through a little bit about what you think and your thoughts about what's happening in the CX landscape currently in the BFSI sector.
Thanks, Carl. Yeah, no, it's a very interesting time at the moment, I think. My role in Qualitest is to account manage some of our largest accounts in our BFSI sector. So that's banks and insurance and finance companies. And I think traditionally that's not been an area where people have seen customer experience, technology-driven customer experience, as actually a critical element of the business. But more and more I see that the phrase customer journey is being referenced by our customers as something they're trying to establish. So that they're digitizing their services to enable their customer to interact with them over the computer, because as we've seen during these COVID times, a lot of our high streets, branches and agencies that you'd normally go and meet, they're just not there now. So actually we need, the banks and the insurance companies need to provide a more online service. I've even heard, for example, that when you're in debt with a bank, that may be completely handled, or there's a goal to have that completely handled by the computer. So you don't have any human interaction outside of, if everything goes smoothly, obviously. So what do we mean by customer journey? Well, the customer journey is effectively the end-to-end journey that a customer does in a given area. So that could be loans, that could be banking cash, it could be taking a mortgage, it could be any of those kind of things. It could be buying insurance, so buying a household insurance or buying life assurance or whatever. So that's actually a customer journey. And what we're talking about today really is how that customer journey, what it's built up of. And within that, there are many facets. So I would say the traditional testing that we all consider, as I said, I've been doing this for a long time. When I first started, we did for our internal users, where we checked that the systems worked, that they performed, that they were usable internally, etc., are still just as valid today. So the services that Qualitest provide around automation and performance testing, around manual testing, etc., are still exceptionally valid in a customer journey. We still have to prove that we've at least achieved the requirements of that journey when it was originally developed. However, now we move slightly further out, because actually our customers are no longer internal. They're all external, certainly within the banking and the insurance world. And that's, but that does depend on where you are in the world. I know, for example, that in the UK, insurance, for example, we mainly buy that over the internet. But in other parts of Europe, it's still a predominantly human interface situation. So there is a cultural change as you move around. But fundamentally, it's still a customer journey, whether you do it with a human or with a computer. Excuse me. So basically, traditional testing still exists. But as an example, these are generic numbers. They're not numbers that are specific to BFSI. But if we look at this, £50 billion a year is lost by having a service that is poor for the customer. They get halfway through, they find buying or using it too difficult, and they drop out. The other angle to the customer is the accessibility of our systems to our customers. Something in the region of 15% of our computer users have accessibility issues. So it's not just about does it work for the average customer. It's very important that we make sure that that additional 15% are also, does it work for them as well? Excuse me. Because in that world, there's £180 million lost each year because people just can't work out what to do. And what I mean there is, if let's assume you're blind and there's a title on the screen. You're looking for the system to tell you that title exists. If that doesn't happen, you don't actually know what screen you're on. You can probably imagine if you're not if you don't have that that problem, you can't imagine what it means to people when they can't actually find their way around. So basically, as I say, traditional testing doesn't go away. There's kind of an extra layer now, which replaces, to a certain extent, what we used to do internally. Yeah. So where we used to get internal people to verify that they could now use the system. But there is we talk about usability and we talk about customer experience. We talk about user experience, customer experience, and there is a subtle difference between the two. I think practically when the terms were coined, they were the same, but over time they've evolved into two completely separate things. So customer experience talks about your overall experience with a brand. So you'll hear us talk about customer experience, and that's fundamentally everything that you do with it. You have to do with it, whether that be human interaction or computer interaction. And then the user experience is more transactional. You know, I'm trying to take a loan. I'm trying to buy insurance on this one occasion. So there's no sort of brand loyalty involved. It's about that particular transaction. So, excuse me. So brand is a big influencer over the experience. If we think about companies like Amazon and Apple, where some of the processes we follow with them, be them human or computerized, don't work as well as they could. But it doesn't stop us continuing our loyalty with that brand. So an example is the Amazon purchasing process sometimes can be a bit problematic, but the after-sales service they provide, the returnability, you know, the no-cost returnability and all that, and the refunds that happen immediately bring customer loyalty. So you have to look further than sometimes an individual transaction when you're thinking about customer journeys. And obviously, if we look at Apple, you have, again, their after-sales service. You know, my Apple phone broke when I bought it. I went back to a shop. I left the shop with a new phone that had already been reinstalled with everything that I had on it. So, yeah, that gives me, even though I had problems with the phone, the after-sales service helps. So it's as we see, customer experience can encompass many, many things. What I wanted to just quickly run through while we're doing this is some of you may or may not have heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's a hierarchy. Maslow's is a human hierarchy that starts with the fact that we need to eat and we need shelter, and that's the minimum requirement for a human being. And then you move up to the point where you get to the very top, where you've got wealth, you've got property, you've got assets that are not necessarily things you're dependent on to live. Yeah, they're just nice things to have. And over the years, people have looked at this from a customer journey point of view. And if you look at the bottom of this, the accurate and availability part, then this is what people need as a minimum. They need their interaction to be accurate and they need the system to be available. Yeah. And that, if we can meet that, the chances are we'll keep them. But if we want to keep them for that transaction, if we want to keep them for the journey, we need to ensure they can engage with the content so it's connected. We need to ensure that the format is appropriate. And in format, I go back to the accessibility again. You know, if our customers have accessibility issues, we need to ensure they have the appropriate front end to work with. And then finally, when it becomes enjoyable, when the brand takes over, that it's intelligent, it's working with you, it's understanding. You know, with big data, etc., and AI and chatbots these days, we interact more with the computer, and actually it can be relatively enjoyable. I'm not suggesting that I would go off and chat to a computer at any moment in time. So that's kind of the extent that, Carl, in my view, of where customer journey starts and finishes. There is obviously, sorry, after you, sir, after you.
No, I was going to say, it's very broad, right? I think the main thing that what we get from what you're saying there is, and I completely agree with you, is it's so broad. It can be such an end-to-end process of, like you said, not just the actual interfaces themselves, but the whole thing, like even getting onto the to a website or a banking app or, you know, an insurance provider and those sort of things. You mentioned, like, you know, in all insurance is done online now in the UK. A lot of that is coming through aggregators as well. So there's marketing behind that as well. So it can't be actually pinpointed to a singular point always. There's always different parts in that whole flow, which is super interesting. And actually, I love that you brought up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because it's actually really, really interesting, because this is where customer feedback is so, so important. And you've also mentioned, there's different types of customers. It's not, 100 years ago or 50 years ago, it was very much, this is your customer, full stop. Now there's much broader array of different customers and needs of customers, like you say. So you have to sort of climb up that ladder to be competitive nowadays, massively. So, I mean, it resonates hugely with what we do and what you do as well, Jeff, with your customers. Yeah. So I completely appreciate that.
Yeah, I guess, Carl, I mean, given your 600,000, I think it was 600,000 you said, or 6 million was it? I can't remember now, but of potential testers out there that are in the ether to do the usability and the UX side of things. I guess you must experience that, particularly in banking, I guess, where every customer has a slightly different need for the same service. Have you got experience where actually, people have actually, two people have come up and one said yes and one said no, this is terrible?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a couple of things behind this, and it all depends on let's take banking as just an example, for example. There's global banks, there's local banks, there's multiple different types of banking, banks in general. But the key differences can be their customers, and you're completely right. There's a couple of things that I always think about it when looking at the demographics of different types of individual. The first is their age group. A lot of the time, we talk about banking and a lot of this sort of digital first banking now and challenger banks coming in. That's a whole another whole topic that we can definitely go into for sure. But the high street banking is gone. I don't necessarily think, I think it was already sort of phasing out before COVID, for example, but that was definitely a trigger to say, now we're going to make it very much more mobile banking. But then you've got a demographic of slightly older individuals who are probably used to going into banks and doing their banking in person, that have to get kind of a bit more used to doing it digitally as well. So age group has a massive thing to do with it, I believe, but also culture, huge differences. I'm very lucky that, and Jeff, you're the same as well, and I work for an international company. Testbirds is German birthplace, and I'm very English, as you can tell by my accent. And the German culture is just very different to the UK culture in terms of how we like to consume data. Obviously, this is a generalisation, but in the UK, personally as well, I like to see short, sharp information, the details, not lots and lots of it's that kind of classic thing, like read these T's and C's. You don't really read them, kind of thing. Whereas within Germany, they generally tend to prefer more sort of data-heavy text and things like that. So you almost have to cater it for different cultures if you are a multinational brand. Like having a one-size-fit-all is just not really that way. And we see a lot of our customers kind of making it a bit more bespoke for each individual countries and having different things within there as well. So I guess like those are the key differences that I've certainly seen when working within this industry, and kind of easing customers away from just one size fits all, that'll do, to sort of a more catered approach for sure. Because like I said, bringing it back to sort of challenger banks and the growth in competition, let's be honest, it's really competitive out there now for banks. You've got the likes, the Monzos, Revoluts, N26s in Germany, who are just growing drastically. And the reason is because they're digital first, and it's easy to bank with them as well. So it's a very interesting, I think, an interesting sort of landscape right now to be within the banking sector, because the older banks, you mentioned it there, like brand is super important. Yeah. But they're maybe lagging behind on the sort of digital front, whereas the challenger banks had the opposite issue where they had to grow their brand, but on the digital front they were just they had functionality in it that could track where your spending was going, what you're spending, all those sort of things. So really, really interesting stuff, I think.
Just a quick one on that front. I'm forgetting I'm moderator here because I'm really enjoying all this information. But someone's just come in with are financial institutions doing enough to put the customer first in their digital landscape? So really, what you were just saying, so they're asking the question: do you think they're doing enough in putting the customer first?
I mean, Jeff, what do you think? Maybe I've done some talking, so maybe I'll push that.
Thanks, Carl. Yeah, we could both talk for England, so absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I think that's an interesting question, Sarah, because I think, as Carl said, sort of the new challenger banks have been established with the customer first initiative in their heads. Yeah, the more traditional banks have hundreds of years of history to support and secure and manage, and so I think the evidence I've seen is certainly the large banks, and I've working with most of the large banks in the UK, for sure, they're all trying to do something, but the problem is so much harder for them because they're having to lay technology on top of traditional technology to get that customer immediacy and availability of data for their customer. But not least that the older and the more traditional banks and insurance companies have a really big cross-section of customers, which is very different to when you're focusing in the new challenger world, where you're probably targeting a specific type of customer. So you could be, as Carl was saying just now, depending on where you are, not just in the world, but even, how old you are as opposed to how young you might be, your requirements can be slightly different. But if you're targeting a particular demographic with your challenger bank, some aren't, but a lot I've spoken to are actually targeting a particular demographic. It becomes a little bit easier to do the customer interaction. But as you can imagine, if you're a bank, the person who phones you could be down as young as 6. I doubt a 6-year-old would actually call, but you know what I mean? It's a 12-year-old maybe trying to find out something about their personal bank account, up to a 100-year-old with and their range of income will range from a very small salary to ginormous salaries. So their desire to use technology to drive, actually the more money you have, the less you want to be involved directly with technology, is an experience I've found. So that's part of the complication for the more should we say the older either insurance banks or finance companies, is they have this history that they still own, and they want to support them all. So they're all doing something, but they're struggling to move as fast, shall we say, as some of the challenger banks can. But they're all desperately trying to catch up, is what I see.
I definitely agree with that. I think they're definitely aware. Like it would be impossible not to be aware of the situation of. There was some, let's be honest, the challenger banks, when they started to really come in sort of 10, even 5 years ago, some of them, it's an obvious sort of competition, and you will always have that. And that's good. It's good for growth of businesses and things like that. But I think the older establishments, whether it be banks or insurance, of course, they do rely on their brand a lot, and that gives them extra time to do things. I think you're right, Jeff. I think they do have real issues with old systems that they're working with. If you're on an old 10-year-old system that you're working with and trying to make it modern, that's that's a large transformation project. That's not a small, starting from scratch kind of thing. But definitely, that's not to say they can't do more. Like, of course, everyone can definitely do more. I think where they're at the moment is probably they're very, very aware of it. Are they putting enough into it? Maybe not. Maybe there's more of that landscape that we could be doing, but that's for everything. I definitely don't want to disrespect any of the large banks or anything like that. Please don't come and find me, but there's always more that you can be doing in the CX world, for sure.
Thank you. Brilliant.
Was there any other questions, Sarah?
I've got one, because I think you hit on COVID, Carl, briefly there. Someone's put, how do we think COVID has affected the focus on UX within the banking sector?
That's a good.
Our opinion.
Yeah, it's a good question. Yours, Carl.
Yeah, I think my honest opinion of this is I don't think it's changed the opinion of banks and their direction. I think it's amplified it and it's been a trigger. So, Jeff, you also mentioned, the closing of banks, like physical banks and things like that. Banks were heading that way before COVID. There was, even in the news, there was things like, closures of X amount of banks, physical banks around the country because of X. And then COVID hit and the banks were literally physically closed. So even if you wanted to go to the bank for a period of time, you couldn't. In that sense, any business would have to just force the direction into a sort of a more digital landscape. And I think, like I say, I don't believe that it's necessarily like a key reason that banking is, or banking and finance in general, because actually just talking about banking, there's also, and challenger banks, there's also financial institutions like digital wealth managers that are popping up everywhere now. Rather than going in to see a wealth manager and, oh, can you take care of my money? It can all be done online now as well. That direction was already happening. It's just COVID kind of was a bit of a catalyst to push it in that direction, I believe.
Yeah, I don't agree with you, Carl, on that one. Certainly, my customers were moving off the high street very, very slowly. But as you say, the need to not be in the office and the need to be able to operate drove them significantly quicker. But the initiative was not directly COVID related. It was more, they were already talking about digital customer journeys 3 years ago. So it's just moved a hell of a lot faster, like it has a lot of things. Not necessarily for good, but it's where we are, I guess. So, which is why
I remember.
Sorry, go for it, Sarah.
Sorry, Jeff. I was just saying, I remember when the pandemic hit initially. I saw some of the big banks were very quick to put the adverts out there on the TV to say, do the face-to-face. So I thought that was very proactive. That was really good. But like you say, I think it has pushed it forward. It was something that was very slow, and it's COVID has kind of moved things on, as you said.
Yeah. But I think the interesting link there, when you talk with the question, are the older banks moving faster, is that actually the older banks are starting to as I said, move quite fast, but they're also thinking through how to do things. So one particular bank I'm dealing with has identified 30 critical customer journeys, and they've done it really effectively. They've brought in external support to help them, because they don't really have the customer journey knowledge, the customer experience knowledge internally. And what they focused on is mapping to the outcome. And these are all things that people like Testbirds and Qualitest, we don't just provide testing, because we see the outcome and because we help people test things, we can also advise on what works and what doesn't work when you start designing things. So for example, I think you mentioned age earlier, and certainly millennials have a very individual need for the digital experience. My daughter, who's very quickly and quite enjoyingly has moved, she never goes to shops now. She hasn't been going to shops for about 4 or 5 years, because she just buys everything online and it gets delivered, and she uses her time to do other things. And I think, again, when you're thinking about customer journeys, you need to think about who those customers are and where they come from. But there are other components of that, like the chatbots and how we interact with them. And I think the interesting thing about them, and I'll ask you a question in a minute if you don't mind, Carl, but
cool.
The interesting thing with them is that you can't really define a proper journey, but you need a chatbot, because you don't know where each individual customer is going to choose to go next. You can direct them to a certain extent, but they still might want to go somewhere else. And what you don't want is that rejection message saying, error 404, because you've lost the customer. I remember this would have been a while ago now, when we first went to electronic telephone answering, and how it caused a real problem in the testing industry, because we didn't know the expected result. And if you go through any of the training and you are a tester, you'll know that it's really pushed hard, that that there are two components to a test, the test case itself and the expected result. But in this world of customer interaction, the expected result cannot always be defined. What what you have to do is to look at the end result and say, is it acceptable, rather than does it match a requirement? Now, obviously, you can run a path that somebody's designed, but if the first call is, would you like to take a loan, and you say yes, and then you want to say, I want to spend £500, and they just keep asking you, how much would you like? No, I want to spend £500. I don't know how much I can have, and the system can't cope with that. You've lost your customer, yeah. So I guess in the UX stuff you do, Carl, you've probably got experience around that, haven't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is it's a really funny point, because I think we've all talked to a chat bot, a voice bot, or anything, anything that's AI, and it's, you get to the point where you're typing or calling and saying, I just put me through to a real human, and then it puts you back to the beginning. Yeah. It's the most frustrating thing in the world. But absolutely, I think this is where definitely testing of any form of sort of AI or custom-facing AI is super, super important. And we all know that, let's be honest, companies are trying to lower the amount of calls going through to customer contact centers, because that's expensive.
Yep.
So actually, it's about defining, like you said, Jeff, defining that real path and understanding that real path, and what is the expected results. We do sort of we call it chatbot testing, but it can also be sort of voice testing as well, where you have to consider actually quite a lot within this when looking at sort of testing it. The first thing is actually dialects. If we've all seen videos of someone with a very deep Scottish accent trying to talk to Alexa, and it just doesn't get it, and obviously that's so frustrating for the customer, because they bought this tool and it doesn't understand it. So one of the things is understanding dialects. That's really, really important. We did this not so long ago with about 2,000 testers in Germany with different dialects and things like that. Very, complex, large test, but it's really important, because if you can't teach the AI in the back end of how to listen to people's accents and different tones, and even with surround sound, I'm in a car park, or I'm on well, hopefully not driving, of course, but I've got loud noises behind me. It needs to be able to cope with that. And the next thing is exactly like you said, Jeff, like, it's how to mitigate any risk of not understanding the expected result. And that's why when we test, is we do this sort of thing, and we give the sort of the questions that a tester would ask to a bot, and then the expected result afterwards, because there's many different ways of phrasing many different things. But the main and the most important thing is to make sure that your customers who would use these tools are going to be satisfied, are going to get the information that they need. Because if they don't, and they can't get through to a human being, you're going to lose a customer very, very quickly. And I think we've all been there, where we've tried to get through. You tried to get a question answered from a chatbot or a voice bot, for example. You just can't seemingly get through, I can't get the point across, and then you go, do you know what, I'm actually done, I'm going to threaten to leave, because then I know I'll get contacted. That's not a happy path for a customer. No. That's not a happy path. And also the fact, if you're having, that's your path of customers have to threaten to leave so you get in touch, you've either got to improve your chatbot or improve the process. And that's super, super important to understand, I guess. And always really important that if you are going to design your own AI, or you have brought on an AI, that it is bespoke to specifically your needs, and also your terminology that your customers use. Because if they use different terminology, you've got no hope of succeeding.
No, absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's interesting you talk about banking, but I think you mentioned earlier insurance, before we move on to the next slide, really. But insurance companies, there are two types, aren't they? You either get to them through aggregators, or you get to them direct. And it's interesting, because the reason you use them will be different. So if you use an aggregator, you're probably looking for the cheapest price, particularly if it's car insurance or something that you just have to have. It's a legal requirement. Okay, I'll just pay the minimum I can. Now, obviously, the more money you have, the less you're focused necessarily on the price. But let's assume that's the reason for you going in. So you'll pick the cheapest one that's turned up on your computer screen or your mobile, and you'll click through. But that takes you into their main system. So the first thing they've done is ensure that they can get that quote up into the aggregator within milliseconds, so that it appears. But then when you hit their website, if it's asking you questions that you've already filled in somewhere else, or or it's not that user friendly, you may well drop out the process and drop back and pick the next cheapest rather than the cheapest. So it's not just, it's interesting how insurance companies will work really hard to be the cheapest, but if they haven't got a suitable customer journey on the back, then actually, and that's more requirement based, because it is just form filling. But then the interesting thing is you then look at the companies that do it directly, and they charge more. They'll charge more than you'll probably ever pay through an aggregator, but they have a ginormous customer base. And that, I think, is probably, I don't know if you agree, is linked around the trust you build around with yourself and the customer. Excuse me, that it's a secure and safe way to actually do business, which brings me nicely to the next, a rather attractive man throwing his money around.
Jeff, just before you do that, I just want to remind the audience today to please keep your questions coming. This is for you and your chance to ask our experts any burning questions you may have. So we welcome you to send them at any time. I'll pick them up. So please go ahead and put them forward. Thanks, Jeff. Just wanted to remind the audience.
Thanks, Anna. Thank you. So what do I mean by trust? And in this instance, the customer perspective. What I mean is that, as an individual, it's not just the customer journey is often based around the trust that you have in the organisation that you're working with. Now, I'll switch back to my accessibility question earlier, which is a service we provide a quality test. At the moment, a lot of organisations will just do what we determine and call automated testing, which is compliance with the standards. So in the UK, for example, we have the WCAG standard. It's not just UK, I think it's worldwide, but, and every country has its own variation of that. But that fundamentally is about 25% of the user journey. It's just almost like doing system testing, yeah? So you're proving you've met the requirement, but you're still not proving that it works for your customer. So, yeah, we do something called paired testing, where we get testers who have no accessibility issues and testers with accessibility issues working together through apps and websites, so that somebody with accessibility will very quickly trust the application they're working with, because they're dependent on, call outs from the screen and vibrations in their mouse, all that kind of stuff that happens when you interact with a website and, for example, you can't see. So the trust is a really, really important part of this, and you build trust by having good customer journeys. But then you have the challenge that we just talked about of how do you prove that customer journey is actually what the customer will use. And what I am seeing interesting, and probably very sadly, is that when you then look at our dear friends, the clients, the banks, the insurance companies, a lot of the really older ones are really struggling with how to get into connection with their customers. Yeah, so if you take a challenger bank, you referred to them earlier, the likes of Monzo and all those kind of things, they started from a customer-centric base. So they worked with customers, answered what they wanted, they developed systems the customers needed. A bank is now trying to retrofit the customer, the older banks. And they also have probably got over 100 years of customer data or more, for some fairly interesting characters, I would suggest, that they have a very, very strong security policies, and they have those for a reason. And they don't let people near their systems unless they're within their company or their suppliers, and we're all contracted, and we have a liability clause that says, should anything happen, etc., etc. So I'm fascinated, actually. Obviously, from an accessibility point of view, we have that challenge, and we manage that with contracts and sometimes using internal customers. But I was interested from your point of view, Carl, how you manage that that situation with the banks and insurance companies that really are nervous about allowing external people that aren't customers access to their systems.
Yeah, it's a tricky stage, isn't it? Because at some stage we do work with financial organisations that, like you said, Jeff, they won't let anyone, let alone in the building. Like, you have to be in the building to actually to be able to test. Now, there's multiple ways that we can get around that. To be honest, we can actually get people to go physically to the building and actually, perform some form of testing. But to be honest, it all comes down to what the access rights are in this sort of thing, right? We always ask clients, okay, you've got security settings about X, but what actual data is there? What are we going to access here? Because a lot of the time, especially with sort of the more usability side of testing that we end up doing, it's more dummy data that we use. So actually they're a little bit more open with regards to that. They're still very security conscious. They want to make sure, but there's multiple things that we can do. There's multiple things that we can do to mitigate any risk. I mean, to start with, at Testbirds anyway, all of our testers, they have to go through like an NDA process, for example, where they sign up to an NDA directly with us as a company, and they give us sort of, tick all the T's and C's boxes. This is not going to be leaked, those things, and luckily to this day we haven't had any of those as well.
Good.
That's a good stage.
Pleased to hear that.
But of course there's other things as well in there, like we do have things where we have to, for example, get NDAs directly with between the bank and the tester, because they want the sort of gravity of the situation to be really impacted there. And there's a lawsuit coming your way from X big bank or X big institution that would really not be great. But there's other things like secure VPNs that we can do, and the most severe impacts that we can have is we also can whitelist IP addresses, for example. Usually as long as they're static, because otherwise it's quite hard to get in. But from a security point of view, there's always a way, and that's as long as we can get some form of access through either of those of those methods, then we can test and then we can get their users, and that's the most important thing. But you are right, a lot of the newer organizations are not less secure but less conscious, I guess, about allowing access to do these usability tests.
Well, I guess they've got less at risk, haven't they? In essence, I mean, if you're a new bank with 100 customers, the risk hasn't changed. It's the impact that will change, obviously, if data gets out. But they're all, I mean, they are pretty tight on their security, I guess. It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because we've obviously been involved working with you and doing our accessibility stuff on our own, where actually, outside of the UK, we've actually won some business in this area, and we've been able to do good, strong, get the demographics, match the demographics for both accessibility and usability, and actually run these tests to give the banks the more comfortable feeling. But actually, what I'm finding in the UK, and again, I'll be interested in your experiences, is that the business wants it to happen, but the security protocols and the security police, and I don't wish to malign them because they're incredibly important, make it almost impossible for them to achieve that. They will not open the firewall for anyone outside of the organisation, which often creates a challenge. And then what I see happening, and it's still valuable, but it's not the real customer, is what I believe Google used to call dog food testing, where actually they pass an application to an internal group that has no direct connection with the application that's being built, and let them actually run some tests. So effectively make them the users. That works, and it's a value, but the impact that can have often is that they are biased towards, they can either be very biased towards the company in a positive way, and therefore everything looks great, or maybe they're aggrieved at that moment in time, so everything will look bad, because they're still within the company, if that makes sense. And I think the challenge that we face going forward, and the bigger sort of traditional banks face, is how we keep that security tight, but enable a larger interaction to happen. I worked with a client who very kindly invited us in to do usability. We did a quote for them. We showed them how we keep them safe and everything. And then at the very last moment, it got pulled because unfortunately the security team wouldn't allow what was actually a very small spend in comparison to the whole build. But after they released it, they've had real problems with their customers not understanding how to get from A to Z. That hasn't necessarily yet convinced them that it's the right thing to do going forward, but it's certainly burnt their tails a bit that they didn't use that sort of wider external audience. They did. Yeah. I mean, we did the rest of the testing for them. We did the performance testing, so it performed really well because we tested it. Yeah, we used it. We did the manual testing to make sure the requirements were all met. But this was a very high-value bank with exceptionally rich customers who just found it tedious. It was more than a screen. They didn't want to know. And it's a really interesting challenge, I think, for the UK, both banking and insurance, and probably globally, I would guess, because there's now so much more we need to think about when we actually build it.
Yeah.
And we test it. And I think it's the same for you guys as it is for us. You know, we are employed by companies to help them at the design stage.
Yeah,
so we absolutely. Use our experience to help them implement a better customer journey. Is that? I guess that's the same for you, yeah?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of points. I think you're right. There's kind of an education piece behind this. You know, educating these sort of older organisations that look, we get it. There's heaps of data there that you don't want to touch, but again, like you go back to, okay, but where are we testing? You know, are we testing on something that's, if we're testing on something that's currently live, for example, that's very simple. There's no security issues around that. We just need dummy accounts. But also, yeah, on the other end of the spectrum, there's, all right, well, let's test a concept. Let's test an idea. You know, let's do things like remote interviews, for example, where we can actually deep dive and understand like who your target audience is. And I think back to your point about the type of people who's, you call it dog food testing, I like that.
Well, to be fair, I can't take credit for that. I think Google...
No, I'm giving you. But that sort of testing it's fine. Okay, I get it. It's like but it is a second best option, to be honest. You know, if you lead user research with hypotheticals, pretend you're a doctor, for example, you know, you do this, and this, you've instantly lost because it's not the real person who's actually going to be using the product, and you're imagining what it's like to be X individual rather than actually being that individual. And it's one of those things that, yeah, working off hypotheticals it's fine for some scenarios, but you still have the real users. The only real issue, like, or where you would use a hypothetical is, let's say, for example, you needed to have a physical card or go somewhere to do X, for example, and they said, oh, it's not really that important for them to do that. Let's just say, hypothetically, they've gone and done that, but it is the real person who's going to do that. That's where you can use that sort of thing. But if you're hypothetically pretending to be someone you're not, that user research has a bias against it because of you know, it's not the right audience for you. So.
No, absolutely. And I think that's where companies like ours can come in and help. In that, I think that is kind of an internal perception of what's good, and actually, yeah, we can be engaged to help educate people on on the pluses and minuses, because you know there is value, as you say, in using the dog food testers. Absolutely. So we would never say don't do it at all. It's always useful before you hand it out to your general customers, because you can be that little bit more comfortable. Because there's always the worry, isn't there, that customer that isn't really a customer but's doing the testing will find something and tell everybody. I mean, you tell them not to, but it's often difficult to secure that. So I think the BFSI world is moving forward at a significant pace. And as we said already, that's really been encouraged by that COVID has encouraged them to move faster in this digitization. Certainly this year, most of the large banks have got the word digitization and customer journey in their yearly accounts now as their target for 2021, 2022. So it's here to stay. It's not going away. And as traditional testers, we need to start to learn that testing doesn't necessarily end when we've proven the requirements are met. There is that step afterwards where we need to encourage people to start thinking about how they engage with their external customer, how they make sure. And you're right, doing things after it's gone live can be useful, but actually has the risk of finding something really serious, and it's too late. You're live. Customers are already in there.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting challenge for the banking and financial industry, in the UK and across the world, as to how their traditional test teams can evolve into a test team that's not necessarily driven by expected outcomes, for example, and all that kind of thing. It's an
more
interesting,
experimental kind of thing.
yeah, more experimental, yeah. Well, there's a whole trend. I'm glad you said that word. Actually, there's a whole trend I've read in the industry where, they're saying that we're experimenters.
Yeah.
We're not necessarily testers now. We become experimenters. We're trying something and saying, does that feel right? Does that feel as if it's doing what it should do? So, maybe there is a change in in the style of how we do things.
Well, I think that's actually really interesting, because I was reading about this not so long ago about just the BFSI sector in general, and obviously the phrase digital first, because obviously that's been around for quite some time, but actually they're moving towards a I forget what it's called now, but it was like an objective first move, or more of a sort of understanding where the gaps are in the market. So it's actually, instead of sort of backtracking and saying, okay, now we need to be digital first, it's actually, okay, no, let's look at us opportunity first. That's what it's called. They were calling it. Actually looking forward from that and saying, okay, we're doing digital first, but let's look one step forward as well. Let's be experimental. Let's do some more research. Let's look at opportunity first to see where are the gaps. What is the next trend? I mean, we talked about challenger banks and even like digital wealth managers. They kind of led with that, but with the phrase digital first. But there is, of course, even for those individuals, opportunity to stagnate. And unless you're looking at that opportunity first, that next step, that experimental phase, then you're always going to fall behind. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think, interestingly, the other thing that I've seen grow is the fintech world. 2-3 years ago, it was around. People were developing for the more traditional banks solutions that would be more customer focused. But in the last 2 or 3 years, I was on a few chat groups, and now I'm inundated with fintech companies who are now almost embedded within the larger banks, the older banks, developing stuff internally to help that bank become more opportunity led or customer led, which is a really interesting move, I think. And that's more experimental R&D, which brings another angle to your testing, really. If it's R&D, how far do you go before you actually do something? But that's probably a story for another day, given our time.
Just looking at it,
we've been chatting for quite a while, so I guess it might be a time to hand back to Sarah to say, are there any questions, Sarah?
Thank you. Thanks very much. There are a couple of questions, one relevant to what you've just been talking about. Is there a balance, do we think, between security and UX with stringent data protection laws?
Yes. I think this is really interesting, especially when you're talking about data security, and there's a big buzzword out there at the moment. Jeff, we spoke about this a little while ago with PSD2, for example. There's a lot of new rules around authentication in payments. But actually this came up, I was speaking to one of our payments project managers the other day, and it came up and it just really interested me, because I thought, no, that can't be right. It's the opposite. But she was basically telling me that actually people are becoming more aware from a sort of a security perspective, that they are having to go through these sort of authentication processes, that when they don't get authenticated, we had actually feedback from testers saying, oh no, I was actually expecting to get an authentication there. And that for me blew my mind, because I've always been sort of very low touch. The security side versus my expectation was, I don't really want too much barriers to entry, but actually there seems to be, because of things like PSD2, sort of a little bit of a shift where even with our cards now, with 3DS authentication and stuff like that, you have to, every 10th payment, put in your PIN, for example, things like that. But people are starting to expect that a little bit more. But of course, you've got to, as a company, you've got to match the the specific requirements that's set out with 3DS, PSD2, those sort of, and PSD3, which is coming, but no one knows anything about it. Compared to the expectations of the customer, because again, this goes back to what Jeff was saying about experimental testing or testing continuously. That was a shock to me, because that's a change in customer behavior. That one person saying, no, I expect to have that authentication coming through each time. That is kind of like a aha moment for me to say, oh, well, maybe we should actually look at this and see, is that something that our customers are expecting continuously? Because maybe we don't do it full all the time, authenticate, but there might be a middle ground where they feel more comfortable to do that because it's happening. So there is that middle ground to be had, I think. But it's just, again, you need to do the research to understand where that is and what customer perceptions are at that time. But then that could change based on what comes out with PSD3, for example, if there's more to come.
I think that's really valid, actually. The whole security issue is a real challenge, isn't it? Not only for the customer, but for the company. And the other side of the coin is there a conflict? And I think, like as Carl said, yes, there is, and no, there isn't. It's about education. It's about understanding, and it's about if we step back to what we were talking about earlier with banks, not big large banks with lots of data not letting people into their environment. That says more about their environment it does about their security. Yeah. So I remember many years ago when this was well back, I guess in the early 2000s, late 1990s, when we started implementing data protection, and that meant that when we were testing, if we used real data, we had to completely lock down the environment so that data couldn't escape, because technically we're not allowed to, but there are certain situations when you can, such as when you've got a data problem in production. And so actually we set about creating a secure environment where that could happen, so that it could be done, because it was a legal requirement, and we had to be able to do that. So I think sometimes it's a little bit more than just the security issue. Sometimes it's also when you face into what is actually an environment that has grown enormously over the years and is probably not completely understood, so that if you push a button in one area, you don't know you'll end up somewhere else. But in today's world of cloud testing and environments in the cloud, you can invest in totally securing them, which would make it safer for our usability or Testbird's usability people, our accessibility people, to access that system during test and not bring any risk to the organization. So I think that there's a movement that has to happen to make that work, really. So,
Jeff, Carl, I'm just conscious of time, so I'm just going to encourage just do a final sweep for the attendees today if they want to jot down any final questions, because we are coming to a close now. We do have Harvey Kleeman, our UX practice lead in Knowledge and Innovation, who's on this webinar as well. So if there are any questions, there might be something that Harvey can come in on as well where relevant. I have got one other question that's come in, and then we'll shortly close after that. But so please put questions through. What do we think banks have done to make the process easier for their clients?
That's a very good question. I think we've already talked about the challenger banks, where the challenger bank is first and foremost customer centric. So they do what they do to enhance the customer journey. So I think to that extent, they've done brilliant things for themselves. But because of their hold on the market that they gain, that itself is rolling over into the more traditional banks. So I do think the banks are really trying exceptionally hard to do this. But I think it's the old phrase of turning the Titanic. Yeah, in a challenger bank, it's like turning a motorboat. Yeah, you can turn on a sixpence. But with the more traditional banks, it's a larger journey for them. And I do seriously believe they are all moving in that direction. They have a way to go, and they have some learning to do. But I think that again, would you agree with that, Carl?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there has been, to be fair to them, there's been a lot of movement in the industry with regards to things like consolidation of all of their services in one app. So like now, you could go onto your banking app and you can see your mortgage, you can see your current accounts, you can see your savings account all in one app. That used to be very, very separate 4 years ago, even in the mobile world. I know that mine changed quite a bit as well. So for the better, of course, that's why I'm still with them. But I think there has been that sort of, that coming together of different services into one app to make it easier for your clients. So there is need, and there is a push there, and you can see it. Of course, whether it's slower or not, that's a different question. But I think we've already said what it is. But it's getting there. But of course, like I say, there's always more to be done.
One little anecdote, actually, one of the banks I'm working with is now using, this is an old traditional bank, is now looking at the customer's life history of payments, and is able now through tick box when you join, is actually to identify if they can, for example, save money by moving their electricity to another company. You have to get permission for that information to be provided, but they can do that now. And they're actually, when you flip into their app, they'll say, did you know that if you put your energy with company X, you could save £50 a month or £20 a month, whatever. So I think, that is something the banks are doing that possibly the customer isn't asking for, but is enhancing the customer journey and will very soon become a norm. So they're leading that trend as opposed to the challenger banks, which aren't leading that trend necessarily in the same way. So yeah, it's an interesting market we're working in at the moment.
Okay, I'm just looking to see if there's any more questions. There isn't. So I think that's really good timing, guys. We're a little bit over, just by a few minutes. But thank you to everyone for your questions and for interacting with us today. If anyone has any additional questions or comments about any of the discussion in today's webinar, please get in touch with the presenters. Their details are on screen right now. Or reach out to me and I'll make sure your question is answered. My contact details are included within an email which will follow once the webinar ends. I'd like to close by thanking our presenters Jeff and Carl for sharing their time and wealth of expertise today, and sincere thanks to our partner Testbirds for jointly collaborating with us on this webinar. It's been an absolute pleasure, Testbirds.
And I have to second that. Working with you, Carl, has been superb. Thank you for your support today, and thank you for the interaction. I think hopefully it's been educational for people and they found it very useful. But I think we've covered a lot of ground in the last 3/4 of an hour. So thank you.
No, thank you. The pleasure's all mine. And likewise back at you guys.
Excellent stuff. And an extended thanks to our audience today, of course, for joining us. So just a heads up before we close, you can save your seat at one of our upcoming webinars by visiting our website qualitestgroup.com/insights/webinars. It leaves me now to say goodbye. So until next time, when we look forward to you joining us again, all the best and goodbye. Goodbye, everyone.